Well, I'm excited today to have with me a good friend, a co-worker, colleague, Jon Eng. Great to have you on the Post-Christian podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Eric.
Well, this has been an amazing season. You were a part of our team here at Gateway in South Austin. You really helped introduce a lot of what we do in terms of reconciliation and justice. And now you've just planted a campus right in the middle of a pandemic. Talk if you don't mind, as you're planning a campus as part of Gateway in Pflugerville, a very diverse part of our town, our metropolitan area. What have been some of the challenges of planting in this season? What have been some of the maybe advantages?
Yeah, well, I think my head usually goes more to the disadvantages because I've felt them kind of pretty upfront and personal over the past several months and stretching into, I guess you could call it, the past 2 years almost. I mean, prior to the pandemic, we already had a couple pauses internally due to some things happening at Gateway, but the pandemic itself was difficult because we hit a stride and we were getting ready to start up with launch on Easter of 2020. And then 3 weeks before then, the pandemic hit. We had to basically shutter all of our plans, stuff that we had been building up to for several months. And that was rough, like needing to almost hit pause a second time over. So we definitely felt like we lost momentum and there was just a change in the dynamic and the energy of our team. But at the same time, like leading through the pandemic was something that wasn't necessarily just particular to our team or our church. We all had to learn how to do it. So I'd say learning how to exercise kind of this leadership where you have to lead through change. You have to adapt and change to some of the circumstances that you really don't have any control over. So that was a good learning for us, I think, for me.
Well, and part of what's been really fun in teaming with you over these last several years is you have just a very entrepreneurial spirit. You've always been great at starting new things. And so when you first came on to Gateway after years of, serving um, with InterVarsity and all that you did there, what about kind of your walk with God and even your personality has led you to be more willing to start new things? A lot of churches seem to be trying to keep things alive, but you've always, at least in my experience with you, been very much wanting to start new things, kind of follow where the Spirit is leading, which I think is important in the midst of trying to reach people who are disconnected from God.
Yeah. I don't know. I think part of it might just be my foundations, watching my dad kind of tap into his own entrepreneurial spirit. So like growing up, I saw my dad doing all sorts of things, right? Like he ran a Chinese grocery store when we were really, really young. And I used to work the cash registers. And I remember bumped my head really bad on the tabletop one time and had a huge gashing wound. So, I mean, from the very beginning, I think I saw it modeled, right? Like, not only did my dad do the grocery store thing, but prior to having me and my brother, I have a twin brother. His name is Tim. Uh, he and my mom basically went out to Austria. So they were double immigrants, right? They immigrated to America and then decided to go over to Austria. And they started up a Chinese restaurant there. The short version of it is my uncle, who still lives out there, basically just called up my dad and said, "We don't have enough Chinese restaurants. Will you start one up?" And they decided it was a good idea. So they just took German from a couple neighbors, 2 months, and then packed their bags and made their way over to Europe and started up a restaurant. So it's definitely a part of, I think, our family story. And seeing how my dad did it just probably ingrained a certain kind of like innovative spirit within myself, if you get my drift. And I think as far as where it impacts and kind of intersects with my faith is just seeing that, when we look at the person of Jesus, here was someone who actually was always innovating, right? Always trying to cross new territories, new boundaries. I love that he crossed cultures too. Sometimes we actually forget that. Yes, he was a Jewish teacher and a rabbi, and someone that so many followed within the Jewish tradition, but he actually reached Romans. He reached the Samaritan woman and so many others that were just outside of his immediate context. And I love that about the heart of God, that God is always looking not just within, like we sing this song sometimes, like he'll leave the 99 to find the one. But, outside of it being kind of a pithy catchphrase or, a fun lyric, I think it's just really true. And oftentimes when it comes to the church, even if you're a startup church, what I've realized is our bent is actually to become more systematized and structured pretty quickly, right? And so we lose that spirit of innovation within, I would even argue, probably the first 6 months or so, because we're so focused and trying to think about, like, how do we get a program running? How do we make sure that all of the systems that are needed, right? And they're valuable and beautiful in their own right. But because we're so focused on that, sometimes we forget God's actually already on the move outside of the walls of the church. And every time I remember that, I just remind myself, well, I want to be a part of that. I don't want to just be within the walls of the church. But just to recognize there's also some really cool, innovative, spiritual things that are happening both within and without the structure of the church.
Yeah. Well, and for you being in the parachurch world where there's a little bit more agility, for you to jump into Gateway, this was, several years ago now, but in a predominantly white city, predominantly, white church, but with a real heart to reach all the nations in our city. One of the things that you first did when you got here was introduce this idea, and Tasha Morrison was on staff at the time with us. She has a Be the Bridge nonprofit.
Yeah.
But you were really intentional about making sure that those that we were reaching, who were people of color, felt welcomed and kept coming. Talk a little bit about the beginnings of the Reconciliation and Justice Network and some of the things that you've done and your leaders have done that have helped bridge that gap, not just to connect believers who may look differently, but actually reaching people too. This has been a real important part of who we've become. Talk about that for a moment, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, I mean, in some ways, it goes back to your earlier question too, around my time with InterVarsity and the parachurch kind of ministry or arm, so to speak. One of the things that one of our supervisors used to say back in InterVarsity, his name is Jason Thomas. He loved to actually talk about the parachurch as this research arm for the church overall. Like, not to see the church and the parachurch as being separate entities, but they're actually in relationship with one another. And I do think that's one of the strengths of the parachurch overall, nonprofit world, because you don't necessarily have the same kind of context as you might have at the church, right? So the beautiful thing about the church is it is very multi-generational, and there's multiple demographics that you're trying to minister to. Whereas when it comes to the parachurch, at least for InterVarsity, it's very focused. We're talking about college students. We focus on faith and leadership development. And in some ways, we don't necessarily have to answer to people who show up at the church every single day, right? Or every single week. So there's a little bit more of almost a research instinct where we can test things out. It might take a church 2 or 3 years to test something out, but for a parachurch, you can do it within a month or call it a semester. And then if it doesn't work, great, let's just go back to the drawing board. With the church, it costs a lot more, right? Like, if you do something, it doesn't work, it affects all of your ministry, your kids, your elderly, and your young parents and your families. So, I mean, I think what I realized through InterVarsity was, man, there's really this thing that I love doing, which is just testing new things out, seeing what works, and learning how to best serve those who are at the margins. You mentioned a little bit our people of color, especially in a predominantly white evangelical context. Oftentimes, I think, like, we talk about multi-ethnic church, But really, the multi-ethnic church or the multicultural church oftentimes has looked more white than anything else. And those who are people of color are kind of just dressing on the side, if you get what I'm saying. Like it's cool that we have multicolored attendance, but it's not as if we've actually learned how to embrace each other and to welcome each other's cultures and the gifts that we have from one another. And sometimes I think our missional perspective, even from the white church overall, can be more from a place of like, we want to reach. And I get that, like we want to reach other people. But what about the question of like, what could we learn from other people? What might they have that perhaps is missing in our context? And that just feels a lot more mutual. And we talk about thriving all the time within our church, like I think about, well, that actually feels like thriving if we're learning from one another. And so one of the things that I really wanted to do at Gateway as I jumped in is just to really help our church to learn, well, what are some of the other stories and narratives that are out there that might not necessarily be as mainstream for our context, and just learn how to listen to each other, right? It begins with relationship and friendship with one another. And so often I think we just miss on the blessing of what those friendships can bring. Sure, they come with their own territory of, oh, like that was an awkward question to ask, or you kind of just stepped on my toes. But man, there's a lot of beauty that I think we can encounter too if we're willing to go there and to develop those patterns of trust. So I know I'm talking a little bit high level, but what do you hear there? And feel free to dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I mean, it's really true that part of what you really brought to our community, and Tasha as well, certainly by hiring you guys and adding you to the staff team, specifically to help us do a better job of thinking about the entire city and not just, even if it's unintentionally, reaching out and connecting with those who look like us, think like us, vote like us. But there were some real practical things that you did. I remember, Beyond Colorblind was a class, a workshop. It's a book
Yeah.
that you had folks read through, but then use it as a springboard into getting to know each other. We did our multicultural dinners, multi-ethnic dinners, and people celebrated. This kind of everybody bringing something grandma used to make
Yeah. Yeah.
and sharing those meals. There was a real celebration of our uniqueness and what we all bring to the table. Talk about some of those ideas, because I know those weren't just your ideas, but the team that you brought together of volunteers. How did you kind of cast vision of what we're trying to accomplish, and what were some of the things that came out of that?
Yeah. Well, I think when we talk about diversity overall, it's one of those things. I mean, diversity, race, racism, and all the beauty and the chaos that comes with it. I think oftentimes people just kind of like, when they hear those terms, at least for some of our people, they either get really charged up and they're like, yeah, let's talk about it, or they want to stiff arm it and do the Heisman. And like, no, I don't want to talk about that. That's too uncomfortable. And so when it comes to things like the potlucks, I think in a very tangible, real way, as I was talking with leaders and discussing different options, what we discovered was, well, let's bring people together around food, around the shared table, where, like, I don't know a single person who would say, I don't want to eat food and just like enjoy other people's like cuisines. So it felt like that was it, almost like it was the low hanging fruit that our church already had. People already know some of their dishes. And I think what I also realized through that journey of like specifically doing some of those multicultural potlucks is we get to live into something that actually produces more curiosity and learning for each person who's involved. Because as you share food, yes, you can just keep it at that level and it's very surface level. Oh, I love your tortillas, like, oh, those pot stickers were really good. But then we started becoming more intentional about, let's have some conversations too while we're having our dinner and our shared meal. Let's actually listen to other people. Let's listen to our African American population, for example, especially as we've seen over the past 5 years plus, at least our media has been paying attention to a lot more of what our Black brothers and sisters have faced for entire generations, and there's been a racial reckoning that we've all had to encounter through this pandemic as well. And I think it taught us how to listen to each other and to hold space for our stories, because like as we were enjoying each other's foods, it wasn't becoming this commoditized almost experience where I just get to enjoy the good parts and I don't have to hear the hard parts of your experience or your life, but we kind of did both. And I think in the midst of that, for our white community, what was really cool was the realization that, oh, we have some work to do to understand what our culture is. Because sometimes I think for some of our white brothers and sisters, it's this idea that I don't have any culture at all, right? There's almost sometimes this jealousy. I don't know if you've encountered this with some of our people, but sometimes it shows up with like, I'm jealous of you, person of color, whoever you might be, because you have this culture that I love, but I don't have any culture. And I actually, these days, I'll say, well, tell me why you say that, because you do have culture, right? You have things like Southern hospitality and cream corn and the barbecues and everything. It's just that we don't identify those things and we don't learn how to cultivate a kind of self-love for who God has created each and every one of us to be. And I think in those gaps, unfortunately, you see evil kind of like majoring on, well, how do I take that perceived gap and fill it with something else? It's what happened with Nazi Germany, right? Like the Nazi youth back in the day didn't have a sense of identity. And so they decided to jump in with this entire, like scheme that Hitler had. And I think I don't know, like it's tough to compare present day to history, but I do see like there's pockets of our communities right now where, because there's a gap of understanding around who I'm created and God to be. When it comes to ethnicity and culture, I think evil is already preying on that and filling it in with this kind of like Christian nationalism that is not God's heart at all. But it sounds good because, well, I've never had culture. And so this makes me feel important. This makes me feel like I have a story now. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for our churches to step in and say, well, here's the heart of God. Let's actually learn together and let's mine our own lives for the foundations that God has already given us.
Yeah. No, that's really important. And it was very stark, during this pandemic with the tragedy of Ahmaud Arbery, and then Breonna Taylor, and then, George Floyd. You did really see this kind of, not just the media, but people paying attention in a way
Yeah.
that you hadn't seen before. And there are a lot of folks saying, well, what do we do? And that's where I feel like you had built for us, along with your volunteers and the people that have been part of this network, and certainly other leaders that have been part of our church, just this framework where we were already having these conversations and it helped us move them deeper. And one of the things that you introduced along with Tasha was just this idea of lament and trying to make that a part of an ongoing part of our worship night, just to acknowledge that things are not the way that they should be. And what's happening is, I think, and the reason this is so important is people without faith see what's on the news about Christianity and they see Christian nationalism and it actually repels them from Jesus, when in reality, it's the message of Jesus that actually unites humanity and actually is a beautiful expression of God's love for all people from all backgrounds. And so that's why this conversation is so important. And I love, you've started a nonprofit with Lisa Jacob and Shedrick Rowry called Just Pax Collective. That's JUSTPAX collective.com, and also on Instagram, Just Pax Collective. Talk about how you've been able to help churches who want to do something. They want to reach and disciple and look like their city, not just in attendance, but from top to bottom. What are some of the things you've introduced that have helped these churches move forward?
Yeah. I mean, some of it we've already talked about it. in bits and pieces, but what we really try to do through our work at Just Pax Collective, and we're a consulting firm, and so we really do frame it as let us help those who are looking for it to become, what I like to call redeemed peacemakers, and those who have actually said, yes, we're going to pursue justice together. And I think oftentimes this work is a bit circular in that you can jump in wherever you want, right? And every context, every organization, every person has a particular starting point. So you might start with a level of, well, I already have awareness around the fact that there is racial injustice, but I don't know how to take action yet, or I don't know how to become an advocate. The reason why I say it's circular is because awareness, activism, or action and advocacy all kind of work in tandem in this circular fashion. I'm always going to be learning, and you're always going to be learning. So our awareness is never going to be fully arrived, right? So I might engage in some awareness work, and I'm taking responsibility for my own learning, let's say, in discovering, let's say, what happened with the Tulsa massacre, right? What was that about? Or, hey, I've never heard about Japanese internment here in the United States. We actually had internment camps. That's disturbing. Well, what was that about, right? And as you raise your level of awareness and you begin to understand yourself as someone who's located and in relationship with different systems and individuals, then you might be able to take some action, right? Like maybe I will vote differently because now I have some awareness around these are some of the policies that have actually really harmed our Black brothers and sisters or our people of color. I might advocate for change within my church or within my community, but then it just keeps on going back into that same cycle because there's more to learn and there's more action to take. And I think as we do those things, we become people who expand our capacity and our bandwidth to go after God's heart. And I always go back to Revelation 7, 9, and 10, right? I want to be a picture and a preview of God's coming kingdom. I don't want to just wait until heaven comes in all of its fullness. I want to be a part of unleashing that right now in the here and in the now, in the present. So, what we tend to do is really just kind of assess where people are at, where organizations are at, and kind of take them from, whatever starting point, whether it's 0 or 3, and move them to the next faithful step. So it's been a lot of work, and it's exciting work. It's stuff that I think we love, but we also understand that it comes with a certain level of cost to ourselves. But because it's such a part of God's heart, I think we're really committed to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you've made a real impact in our church in the 11 years I've been here. I think you've been here 4, maybe 5 years.
Going on 5. Yeah.
Coming up on 5. I just know that, we now have a board of directors from different backgrounds in a way we hadn't before. We're seeing a staff that's becoming more and more reflective of our church family. And as we continue to move forward, your campus in a very diverse part of town, is just another opportunity for us to be more like Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 and 10. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jon, for what you're doing. I love, obviously teaming with you, love you and your family, and just grateful for the ways you're helping us move forward. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks, Eric. Yeah, it's been a joy, privilege. It's definitely been an honor just to be with you too and grow, and really grateful for your leadership too. I think one thing that you'll probably never say, but I want to just say it for whoever's listening out there. Eric is just an awesome leader, and he's one of those guys that does recognize, I think, where he's located socially, culturally, ethnically. But out of that, I've really seen you exercise your presence, your leadership on behalf of others, really empowering and uplifting other voices. And I think it shows, over at South Campus, you've got a great crew and an amazing community. So thanks for serving and really being a part of God's heart here.